Most people who feel disconnected don't realize it at first. They just notice that something essential has gone quiet inside them. Life continues to move forward. You wake up, answer messages, go to work, have conversations, make plans. On the surface, nothing seems dramatically wrong. And yet, beneath all of that movement, there is a strange absence, as if you are present everywhere except in yourself. You may not feel sad in the way people usually describe sadness. You may not feel anxious in a way that looks obvious from the outside. Instead, there is a sense of distance, a subtle emotional fog, a feeling that you are observing your own life rather than inhabiting it. You do what needs to be done, but the inner spark that once made things feel meaningful seems far away. Carl Jung believed that this experience is far more common than we think, and far more misunderstood. In modern psychology, disconnection is often approached as something to eliminate as quickly as possible. We search for techniques to feel better, to feel more, to feel normal again. But Jung took a very different view. He did not see disconnection as a defect of the psyche. He saw it as a message. According to Jung, the psyche has its own intelligence. It does not simply break down without reason. When it withdraws, numbs, or creates distance, it is often responding to something that has become emotionally overwhelming, contradictory, or unsafe to integrate consciously. In other words, disconnection is not always the absence of feeling. It is often the psyche's way of containing too much feeling. Many people reach this state after long periods of emotional adaptation. They learn to be strong, to function, to stay composed, to take responsibility early in life. They became skilled at managing external demands while quietly ignoring their inner world. Over time, the psyche adapts by pulling energy away from feeling and meaning, redirecting it towards survival and control. Jung described this as a form of inner withdrawal, a turning inward of psychic energy when the outer personality can no longer carry the full weight of what has been lived. This withdrawal does not happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually. At first, there may be brief moments of numbness, a sense of emotional flatness after stress, a loss of interest in things that once mattered. Over time, if the inner conflict remains unresolved, the psyche may deepen this withdrawal, creating a more persistent sense of disconnection. What makes this state so confusing is that it often appears when life looks successful from the outside. You may have achieved stability, competence, or recognition. You may be doing everything you were taught to do, and yet feel further away from yourself than ever. Jung believed this is precisely when disconnection tends to emerge. He observed that when a person's conscious identity becomes too narrow, too adapted to expectations, roles, or survival strategies, the deeper layers of the psyche begin to retreat. Not out of punishment, but out of necessity. The soul does not disappear, it steps back. In Jungian psychology, the soul is not sentimental or fragile. It is purposeful. When it withdraws, it does so to protect its integrity. It refuses to remain fully present in a life that no longer reflects the inner truth of the individual. This is why disconnection often carries a strange paradox. On one hand, it feels empty. On the other, it feels heavy. There is a quiet grief beneath the numbness, a sense that something meaningful has been lost, even if you cannot name what it is. Jung would say that this grief is not pathological. It is symbolic. It signals that the old way of being in the world has reached its limit. Many people try to push through this state. They distract themselves. They increase productivity. They search for stimulation, affirmation, or intensity to feel something again. But Jung warned that forcing reconnection too quickly can deepen the split rather than heal it. The psyche cannot be commanded back into wholeness. Disconnection is often the beginning of an inner reorientation, a pause imposed by the psyche itself, a moment where the old identity no longer works, but the new one has not yet formed. This is why Jung associated disconnection with the early stages of individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, beyond adaptation and expectation. Individuation rarely begins with clarity. It begins with confusion, with a loss of direction, with the unsettling realization that the life you are living no longer feels inhabited from the inside. When people say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," Jung would ask a different question. Which self are you referring to? Often, the self that feels lost is the adapted self, the version of you shaped by necessity, approval, and survival. The deeper self has not disappeared. It has simply withdrawn its energy, waiting for conditions that allow it to emerge more truthfully. This waiting can feel unbearable, especially in a culture that equates constant feeling with aliveness and constant clarity with health. Jung understood that there are phases where the psyche goes quiet, not because it is dead, but because it is reorganizing itself at a deeper level. Disconnection, in this sense, is not the end of feeling. It is a threshold, and thresholds are uncomfortable places to inhabit. One of the most damaging misunderstandings about disconnection is the assumption that it is the same as depression. While the two can overlap, Jung was very clear that they are not identical states. Depression, in its classical sense, is often accompanied by a heavy emotional pain, a sense of hopelessness, self-reproach, or a collapse of vitality. Disconnection, on the other hand, is frequently marked by emotional distance rather than emotional pain. Many people who feel disconnected will say, "I don't feel sad. I just don't feel much of anything." This distinction matters, because when numbness is treated as if it were sadness, the psyche can feel even more misunderstood. Jung observed that the psyche sometimes reduces feeling not because it lacks emotion, but because there is too much emotion beneath the surface. When inner experiences become too complex, contradictory, or threatening to integrate consciously, the psyche may shift into a state of containment. Feeling does not disappear. It goes underground. In modern terms, this aligns closely with what we now call the freeze response. Freeze is not a failure of the nervous system. It is not weakness. It is the body and psyche's most conservative survival strategy. When neither fight nor flight is possible, the system slows down. Energy is withdrawn. Sensation is dampened. Conscious engagement with the world becomes minimal. Jung did not use the language of neuroscience, but he described the same phenomenon symbolically. He spoke of psychic energy retreating from the outer world and turning inward when the ego can no longer safely mediate inner and outer demands. In this state, people often feel as if they are living behind glass. They can see the world. They can respond to it. But they are no longer fully touched by it. Joy feels distant. Pain feels muted. Even love can feel strangely unreachable. This can be deeply frightening, especially for individuals who value emotional depth, connection, and meaning. Many begin to worry that they are broken, damaged, or permanently detached. Jung warned that this fear often intensifies the withdrawal. Because the psyche does not retreat without reason, disconnection often emerges after prolonged emotional self-abandonment, not necessarily in dramatic ways, but in subtle, repeated moments where one's inner truth was ignored in order to adapt. Saying yes when the body said no. Staying composed when something felt overwhelming. Carrying responsibility that exceeded emotional capacity. Suppressing grief, anger, or fear because there was no safe space to express it. Over time, these adaptations accumulate. The ego becomes skilled at functioning, but increasingly disconnected from the deeper layers of the psyche. When the gap becomes too wide, the psyche intervenes, not with symptoms that scream, but with silence. Jung believed this silence is meaningful. He described it as a compensatory movement. When conscious life becomes one-sided, the unconscious responds by pulling energy away from that one-sidedness. Disconnection is the psyche's way of saying, this way of living can no longer continue unchanged. This is why attempts to snap out of it often fail. The psyche is not asking for more effort. It is asking for a different orientation. People in this state often report a strange contradiction. They feel exhausted, yet restless, empty, yet overwhelmed, detached, yet internally tense. This is because the freeze response holds enormous energy beneath its stillness. The system is not at rest. It is immobilized. Jung understood that when psychic energy is blocked from expression, it does not disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, creating pressure that can manifest as fatigue, tension, headaches, digestive issues, or a persistent sense of inner strain. This is also why disconnection is often accompanied by bodily symptoms. The body carries what the psyche cannot yet symbolize. Jung famously said that what we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. We could add, it also appears as sensation. The danger lies not in disconnection itself, but in misinterpreting it. When numbness is pathologized too quickly, people may try to force feeling through stimulation, intensity, or emotional provocation. Jung cautioned that this can re-traumatize the psyche. Feeling cannot be coerced back into existence. Reconnection does not begin with intensity. It begins with safety. Jung believed that the psyche only returns from withdrawal when it senses that the ego is willing to listen differently, not to dominate, fix, or control, but to relate. This requires a radical shift in attitude. Instead of asking, how do I get rid of this state? Jung would invite the question, what is this state asking of me? Disconnection often signals that the old identity, the one built around adaptation, performance, or survival, has reached exhaustion. The psyche is no longer willing to lend its energy to a life that does not reflect inner truth. This is why many people in this phase feel lost. Direction disappears, motivation fades. The future feels vague or unreachable. Jung saw this not as regression, but as a necessary descent. Before a new orientation can emerge, the old one must dissolve. This dissolution is uncomfortable. It strips away familiar reference points. Roles that once provided meaning no longer feel real. External achievements lose their emotional reward. The ego feels unmoored. Yet Jung insisted that this is often the most honest phase of psychological development. Disconnection removes illusion. It reveals where life has been lived from the outside in, rather than from the inside out. The psyche does not rush this process. It cannot. Integration requires time. The soul does not return to a life that has not yet made room for it. and so the waiting continues, not as punishment, but as preparation. One of the most unsettling aspects of disconnection is the disappearance of meaning. Things that once mattered no longer seem to reach you. Goals that once motivated you now feel strangely irrelevant. Even ideas that used to inspire you may sound hollow. Many people interpret this as a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with them. Jung saw it differently. He believed that meaning does not vanish randomly. Meaning withdraws when it has become attached to a form of life that no longer fits the inner reality of the individual. In this sense, the loss of meaning is not a collapse, it is a clearing. Jung often spoke of psychological development in symbolic terms, and one of the most important symbols he used was death. Not physical death, but psychic death, a necessary ending of an old orientation of consciousness. When the psyche enters a phase of disconnection, it is often because a former identity has reached its natural limit. The problem is that modern culture has little tolerance for these in-between states. We expect continuity. We expect progress to be visible. We expect identity to remain stable. Jung understood that the psyche does not evolve in straight lines. It moves in cycles. Expansion is followed by contraction. Engagement is followed by withdrawal. Disconnection is one of these contractions. It is a phase in which the psyche dismantles what no longer belongs to the future self. This dismantling is quiet. It does not announce itself dramatically. It happens through loss of interest, emotional distance, and a subtle withdrawal of vitality. Jung would say that this is the psyche reclaiming its energy. For a long time, that energy may have been invested in roles, relationships, beliefs, or ambitions that were necessary at one point but have since become constraining. When the psyche can no longer authentically support these structures, it pulls back. The ego experiences this as emptiness. The psyche experiences it as liberation in preparation. This is why people in this phase often feel as though they are waiting, even if they don't know what they are waiting for. There is a sense that something new is forming, but it remains out of reach. Jung referred to this as a gestational phase of the psyche. Nothing seems to happen on the surface, yet everything is happening underneath. This can feel unbearable for individuals who are used to defining themselves through action, productivity, or relational engagement. The silence feels threatening. The lack of clarity feels destabilizing. But Jung warned that premature action during this phase often reinforces the old pattern, rather than allowing something new to emerge. The psyche needs time to reorganize itself. One of Jung's most radical insights was that healing does not always involve doing more. Sometimes it involves tolerating less certainty, less control, less identity. Disconnection forces this confrontation. It confronts you with the limits of the ego's strategies. The ways you once made sense of yourself no longer work. The stories you told yourself lose their emotional power. What remains is a raw, undefined inner space. Jung believed this space is sacred. He compared it to the alchemical nigredo, the dark, chaotic phase of transformation in which matter breaks down before it can be reformed. In this phase, nothing feels ordered or meaningful. Yet without it, transformation cannot occur. Trying to escape this phase too quickly is like interrupting a process that has its own inner logic. What actually helps the psyche reopen is not pressure, but permission. Permission to not know. Permission to not feel deeply yet. Permission to rest without justification. Jung emphasized the importance of listening rather than forcing. He believed that the unconscious communicates not through commands, but through symbols, moods, dreams, and bodily sensations. When disconnection is present, the psyche is often asking for a different quality of attention. Not analytical, not corrective, but receptive. This is why attempts to fix disconnection often fail. The psyche is not broken. It is protective. It will not re-engage until it senses that it will be met differently than before. Safety is not only external, it is internal. The ego must become less intrusive, less demanding, less invested in immediate answers. Jung believed that when the ego softens its grip, the psyche gradually begins to respond. This response does not arrive as a sudden emotional breakthrough. It begins subtly, a brief moment of feeling, a fleeting sense of presence, a dream that carries symbolic weight, a quiet resonance with something ordinary. These moments are easy to miss, especially if you are looking for intensity. But Jung would say that these small signals are signs of return. The psyche does not rush back into a life it once withdrew from. It tests the environment. It senses whether the new attitude is stable, whether listening is real or performative, whether patience can be sustained. This is why reconnection often feels slow and fragile at first. There may be moments of contact followed by renewed distance. This is not regression, it is calibration. The psyche is learning whether it is safe to inhabit consciousness again. Jung believed that one of the greatest mistakes people make in this phase is interpreting slowness as failure. In reality, slowness is often the sign that something profound is reorganizing itself. The soul does not move at the speed of the ego. Disconnection teaches humility. It strips away the illusion that we are fully in control of our inner lives. It reveals that psyche and soul operate according to deeper rhythms. When this rhythm is respected, something remarkable begins to happen, meaning slowly returns, not as an idea but as a felt sense. Not because life looks better, but because life feels inhabited again. This meaning is different from before. It is quieter, less performative, more grounded. It does not demand constant expression. It simply exists. Jung would say that this is the emergence of a more authentic relation to the self. Not the self you constructed, but the self that waited. Sensitive people often experience disconnection more intensely, not because they are weaker, but because they perceive more. Jung was deeply aware that individuals with a rich inner life are also more vulnerable to overwhelm. When perception is deep, adaptation requires more psychic energy. And when that energy is exhausted, withdrawal becomes inevitable. Many people who enter a state of disconnection have spent years finally attuned to their environment. They sensed the moods of others. They anticipated expectations. They adjusted themselves emotionally to maintain harmony or safety. Over time, this sensitivity, once a source of depth and connection, became a survival strategy. Jung would say that the psyche cannot remain in a state of constant outward attunement without consequence. When sensitivity is not balanced by inner anchoring, it leads to depletion. Disconnection then functions as a protective closure, a way of conserving what remains of psychic energy. This is why many sensitive individuals feel guilt or shame about their numbness. They remember themselves as caring, engaged, emotionally available. The contrast feels like betrayal of who they used to be. Jung would argue that this comparison is misleading. The psyche does not erase sensitivity. It shelters it. Numbness, in this context, is not the opposite of sensitivity. It is sensitivity that has retreated too deeply to remain exposed. The danger arises when people begin to identify with this state. When disconnection lasts for a long time, it can quietly become part of one's self-concept. People begin to say, "This is just how I am now," or "I am someone who doesn't feel much." Jung warned against this identification. No psychological state is meant to become an identity. Disconnection is a phase, not a destination. When it is mistaken for a permanent condition, the psyche may remain closed longer than necessary, not because it cannot reopen, but because the ego has stopped expecting anything different. Jung believed that expectation plays a subtle but powerful role in psychic life, not forced optimism, but an openness to movement. When numbness becomes fused with identity, the psyche loses the relational space it needs to respond. This is why Jung emphasized relationship, not only with others, but with one's inner states. Disconnection needs to be related to, not inhabited. This relationship is delicate. It requires curiosity without pressure, presence without demand, a willingness to stay close to what feels empty without trying to fill it immediately. As individuation continues, the psyche gradually begins to release what it has been holding. Feeling does not return all at once. It emerges in fragments, often in unexpected places. A sudden emotional response to music. A moment of grief that surfaces without explanation. A quiet joy that appears briefly and then fades. These moments can be unsettling. After a long period of numbness, feeling can feel overwhelming. Jung noted that when the psyche has been closed for a long time, reopening can feel like vulnerability all over again. This is why many people unconsciously resist reconnection, not because they prefer numbness, but because feeling feels dangerous. Jung understood this paradox. He believed that the psyche opens only as much as it trusts it can be contained. If life still demands constant performance, emotional availability, or adaptation, the psyche may continue to regulate itself through partial withdrawal. Individuation, therefore, requires not only inner work, but outer adjustment. The way one lives must begin to reflect the inner transformation. Boundaries may need to change. Expectations may need to soften. Pace may need to slow. The psyche does not return to the same conditions that caused it to withdraw. This is one of the most difficult truths of individuation. You cannot feel deeply again and live exactly as before. Something in the structure of life must shift. Jung believed that this is where many people struggle most. They want the return of feeling without the cost of change. But feeling and truth are inseparable. When the psyche re-engages, it brings with it awareness of limits, needs, desires, and contradictions that can no longer be ignored. This awareness is not cruel. It is clarifying. As feeling returns, so does discernment. What once felt tolerable may now feel draining. Relationships may be experienced differently. Roles that once defined identity may feel hollow. This is not regression. It is differentiation. Jung saw individuation as a process of becoming more oneself, not more acceptable. This often involves disappointment, not because life becomes worse, but because illusions fall away. Disconnection prepares the ground for this clarity. It strips away borrowed meaning so that authentic meaning can emerge. It dissolves false continuity so that a deeper continuity can be established, one that is rooted in the self rather than in adaptation. When feeling begins to return, it often comes with grief. Grief for time lost. Grief for self-abandonment. Grief for versions of oneself that were necessary but costly. Jung believed that this grief is not something to bypass. Grief is the psyche's way of acknowledging truth. Only what is mourned can be integrated. As this mourning unfolds, a new relationship to inner life becomes possible. Feeling no longer needs to be constant or intense to be trusted. Presence becomes quieter, steadier. Meaning no longer needs to be proven. Jung would say that this is the movement toward inner authority, a life guided less by external validation and more by an attunement to the self. Disconnection, in retrospect, reveals itself not as an error, but as a turning point, a place where the psyche refused to continue on a path that no longer served its wholeness. It is not the absence of soul. It is the soul insisting on truth. Learning to live with disconnection does not mean resigning yourself to it. It means no longer fearing it. Jung believed that the psyche suffers most when it is mistrusted, when every inner movement is judged, corrected, or rushed. Disconnection asks for a different response. Not analysis, not urgency, but respect. When you stop treating numbness as an enemy, something shifts. The inner struggle softens. The psyche no longer has to defend itself so strongly. Jung observed that trust is one of the most healing attitudes the ego can offer the unconscious. Trust does not mean passivity. It means staying present without interference. It means allowing inner life to move at its own pace, even when that pace feels unbearably slow. Jung believed that the psyche knows where it is going, even when consciousness does not. This is why forcing clarity too early often leads to confusion. The psyche reveals itself gradually, in symbols, in moods, in subtle shifts of interest and feeling. When these are honored, the sense of inner continuity begins to return, not as certainty but as orientation. Disconnection teaches something few other states can teach: humility before the inner world. It shows you that depth cannot be commanded, that meaning cannot be manufactured, that feeling cannot be demanded back into existence. And yet, when the conditions are right, it returns, quietly, honestly, without spectacle. Jung would say that when the soul returns, it does not come as it was before. It comes changed, more grounded, less willing to be wasted, less interested in performance, more attuned to truth. This is the gift hidden inside disconnection, not comfort, but authenticity. If you find yourself in this state, you are not broken. You are not behind. You are not failing at life. You are standing at a threshold that cannot be crossed through effort alone. The psyche will move again. Feeling will return. Meaning will reform. But only when it no longer has to protect itself from the life you are living. And if this perspective resonates with you, you may want to explore more of Carl Jung's insights into the psyche, individuation, and the deeper rhythms of inner life. These themes ask for patience, but they offer something rare in return: a relationship with yourself that no longer depends on constant connection to be real. Sometimes the soul speaks loudest when it speaks least.